Some projects are long-term. In 1961, when I was 13, I had a vision of multimedia access to all world's knowledge. In the early 90s, I started to work on a prototype for a system for universal media searching. In 1994, that was accepted as one of 18 projects to represent Canada at the G7. In 1995, the G7 decided to have 11 pilot projects to deal with all the aspects of information for the world. Number 5 was multimedia access to world cultural heritage, and my project became one of 4 for the world. On the basis of that, the European Union decided in 1995 to create a Memorandum of Understanding for multimedia access to Europe's cultural heritage. And this led in 1998 to the establishment of a Medici framework for teaching, mainly at the polytechnic level, students how to deal with all the challenges of the new media. At the same time, there was a vision that we should have something at the university level, and mainly at the graduate and postgraduate level, to deal with the methodological problems involved when you started creating virtual reconstructions of sites, of cities, of monuments, and so on. I was asked to create the first eCultureNet for Europe, which I began informally in 1998 and formally in 2002. In the meantime, one of my colleagues, Professor Jacques Poulain in Paris, had a vision of creating a new university of culture for Europe and asked me to be one of the founding members. When I thought about this, I realized if we did the old-fashioned thing of assuming that Europe is the center of the world and that everyone else is really just colonies and catching up countries, that this would be a complete failure. Obviously, we have Shakespeare, Dante, Goethe, Rembrandt, Leonardo, Cervantes. All of these are greats. And it would be stupid to say that they are all not valuable anymore. But to pretend that the corpus of European culture is everything is equally stupid. So we need a new model of culture that acknowledges the great things that Europe has done, but also equally acknowledges the great things that China, India, Cambodia, and all the other great cultures of the world have done. And so in 2004, at the invitation of my friend, Professor Frederick Andres, I created 35 lectures to try to explain what it was that made the West the unique image-producing continent that it is. And as I started to work on this, I realized that languages were important, and so I thought, well, I'll just look into languages a bit. Well, that little project turned out to be a 10-year project, and what we're going to see this morning, or beginning this morning for the next 26 episodes, will be the results in the form of a book on alphabets of life. And it takes place in 12 chapters and 13 appendices, and I'll explain those in a moment. Thank you. The book is called Alphabets of Life, and it tells the story of two great movements, or two great sources of letter making. One in Russia and one in India and around the Sanskrit language. For the cover page, I've decided to use a page from a remarkable old alphabet that is said to go back to 600,000 BC, but in the version that we have it today, goes back to something like 11,000 BC, according to the sources. It is made of all kinds of symbols, and you see here a funny rotating thing to which we'll return, because they had a spiral And that spiral was used to create all the letters. We'll return to that in Appendix 12 when I talk about how we make the letters. To just give you a glimpse of these letters, I'll show you two of them. Here is one where we see a man and a woman, and then two symbols. This one, which is now linked with the A symbol in modern society, and this one, which is the Vesica Pisces. You see the same symbols here. The male symbol was the breath of God in the old days. And you see two angels handling it here. On another page, we see the man and the woman again, and their male and female symbols, and then producing a young boy. And so, the alphabets of life started not just as a communication of people who are alive, but in fact, a story of how life itself begins. And that is reflected in other languages as well, as we'll see, because alphabet comes from alpha, beta, but in other languages that's alpha, vita. And again, the alphabet of life. In one of the earliest languages that comes from India to Africa, the language of the Abyssinian Indians, we see that the first four letters are Al, Le, Fu, Beth. And this is probably the first time that we have the word alphabet in a form. We'll see later that alphabet is really A-L-P-H, so letters 1, 12, and 17, and that sequence is important, but that's a later part of the story. My book is basically about the history of the alphabets, and mainly about the alphabets from about 1900 BC to the present. The opening introduction will be about the prehistory of alphabets from about 6000 BC. And to give you a big picture, the first chapter will deal with marks, signs, and symbols, and focus on what happened in Russia, and show how symbols start as basically symbols in four directions, and that one bit of those directions, one side of those directions gets taken off, and that becomes what we call modern letters. A second chapter will explore what happens in India with the Sanskrit framework, and show how the Vargas get linked up not only with the five elements, but with the five organs, and become the principles of life, called tattvas, of which there are 33. Well, there's a simplified version of 25, and those become the 25 stoicheia of the Greeks, and then there are multiplications of that. The next chapter is about breathing in life, because alphabets are not just about speaking, but they are about controlling the breath. And the chapter beyond that is about movements, because the early alphabets were all concerned with movements. In India, you have three kinds of movements. You have the mudras, with the hands, and in the dance of life of Nataraj or Shiva, there are 108 basic movements. So life is a dance. But so you have the hand movement, the body movement. If you link this with sound, it becomes a mantra. And if you link this with a god or a goddess, it becomes a yantra. And so the Shri Yantra, for example, is a remarkable combination of 119 triangles to create a geometrical version of the goddess. And, as we'll see in chapter 4, some of those yantras of the goddess Shri also become the framework or a grid for letter making. Having explained the absolute basics of how letter making happens, I explore how it's applied to the heavens. In India, they were applied mainly to the nakshatras and to the 12 zodiac signs. In other countries, they were also linked to the planets. The next chapter then shows how this applies to the earth and how it gets linked with, well, for example, we have Saptaloka, 7 regions. We have 7 rivers, Sapta Sindhu. In other places, we have 5 rivers, such as the Panchab, which, of course, in English becomes the Punjab. And in the east of India, northeast of India, we have 3 rivers. So we have the Sarasvati, which of course went underground. And so we have the Yamuna and the Ganges. And those 3 then become the three rivers, which link up with the Triveni and link up with the 3 gunas, and with everything 3, and Trishulas and so on. Having, again, explained how this applies to cosmology, because this is not just a story of what we say, but how we organize the world. So it's how the letters and their symbols get linked with the whole of creation. Having done that in the first chapters, then in chapter 7, I explain how all of this goes eastwards. That is to say, what starts in northern India goes to southern India and Sri Lanka, and then via languages like Pali and Brahmi, which of course starts in the north and under King Ashoka becomes the official script of the Buddhists. And through that, it goes all the way to the east, all the way to Japan. And in fact, although we think of Sanskrit as an Indo-European language, and it's one of the most important in that, it's the only of the great languages of the world that does not just apply to one language family, but to 8 of the 10 great language families of the world. And I'll show you how that happens. So the same 7 Vargas that you have for Sanskrit get copied, in fact, the very same mouth diagram gets copied into Thai and gets copied into more than 40 great languages in Southeast Asia. Then having gone eastwards, we go westwards and show how the same principles, slightly modified now, go to Africa, mainly to Ethiopia, Sudan, and of course in the West, when I was growing up, we learned about, oh yes, all of civilization begins in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. But in fact, these are new civilizations between 3,000 and 4,000 BC. But 7,000 BC, the only great civilizations were the Indus Valley and the Sudan, or Abyssinia and Ethiopia. And these places developed hieroglyphs, so the Egyptians got their hieroglyphs and their pyramids from the Sudanese and the Ethiopians and the Abyssinians. And then I explain how, so the Abyssinian is 27 letters, Ethiopian has 26 letters, and then you get a compressed version of 22 letters, and that becomes the version that becomes popular in the West. Having done that, I explore what the Western alphabets were and try to give a sense of how they spread throughout Europe. And in the following chapter, I try to do a classes of alphabets, because we have, of course, A, B, C, D in English, but in Arabic we have A, B, G, D. And in Cyrillic we have A, B, V, G, D. And so I try to explain how some of these things come together. In chapter 11, I make the link between the actual letters and the numbers and the shapes in which letters were organized. So in the north, people would use an octagon and then link all the sides of the octagon with letters. Or the Hebrews preferred a square, a cube, and linked all the 22 letters within a cube. And this then also links up with games, because the great games, for example, in your country or to the south, you developed something called chess. Chess is 8 times 8 is 64, and that is also very important for the Vastus. And if you do 9 times 9, you get 81, which is for certain kinds of buildings, and then 12 times 12 is for other kinds of buildings. I'll get back to that in Appendix 12. And then finally, I will give some conclusions to try to show you that although the official pronunciation of languages in India, Russia, Europe is very different, there are underlying patterns. And I will try to explain some of the big picture of that, and then come back to that in detail when I get to Appendix 12 and try to explain the nitty-gritty of how you make letters. But that is the end of the book itself, but there are many other aspects, so I've included 13 appendices to try to deal, for example, with signs. In the East, there was a whole, well, today there's a great talk about Internet of Things. People want to have, to identify not just people, but to identify objects. And they have special symbols for objects. Well, in the old days, people had movable property, like cows or goats and so on. And they branded each goat or cow or horse with a special symbol. And these special symbols, each king had, and each tribe had their own symbols. And some places actually branded their people with these symbols. And they were called tamgas. And these tamgas are like the very early symbols that I was talking about amongst the Russians. They go in all 4 directions, and then they get separated and become single ones. And this is particularly important for Chinese, for Turkish, and for the languages around the Caspian Sea, Abkhazian, Circassian, and so on. And then there are stories that are connecting all of these cultures, and I'll go into some of those. For example, we have an idea of a bird that is a rebirth of life. It's the phoenix in China, it's the hauma bird in Persia, and it's the firebird in Russia, and so on. And then I'll try to go through some, well, I'll show you how, for example, we learn in school about Hebrew or about Chaldean, but there are 7 different versions of Hebrew. There are 17 versions of Chaldean. There are 33 versions of Greek. So I'll try to show you how some of these link and what their different names are in different systems. And then I'll try to explain the evolution of the alphabets. And then I'll have an appendix to show you how the motion goes. That is to say, how we get from the East and move slowly via the Silk Roads and via the waterways, the so-called spice roads along the sea, to Europe. And that will be the main part. Well, and then in the final ones, I'll take you through some of the geometry to show that the geometry applies to the heavens, and so it becomes not just a map of how you make a building, but actually is a symbolic form of the whole of the Milky Way, and that the swastika isn't just a sign that you see as you drive along the road, but is in fact a way for organizing the whole universe, and that this applies not only to India, but also to Russia, and really all over the world. Well, that is in a nutshell what we're going to be talking about, but the real adventure will begin when we actually begin. Thank you very much.